So I'm sitting here on the ground next to my Altezza with my coilovers apart for the 20th time, hopefully the final time, fingers crossed. And I've realized I've had people in the past ask me how I set up my suspension, because I've got my car certified and it's relatively low and I don't have any issues, which is the big thing. For many of you who have this chassis, most of you probably watching this video, you know that if you start to get low with these cars, then you start to have an issue with the upper control arm hitting the strut tower. So you'll be driving along and it goes bang, 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 bang. Now, I've got my car relatively low, but there's room for improvement, which is what I'm working on now. But I want to walk you through what causes that problem and how to fix it, as well as some other things for getting your suspension set up for going low. So the big thing that's actually happening when your car is going bang, bang, bang is your upper control arm is hitting your strut tower. That's the obvious thing. Now, why is it doing that? So what happens when people normally have coilovers is you have your spring in there and you have it sitting on the spring perch, and then you lower your car by winding this bottom mount up, which shortens the shock, which pulls all of this higher, which makes your car sit lower. Now the problem with that is that when you actually wind this up, when you wind it up the threads to make your car lower, you are pulling the lower control arm up, which pushes the spindle up, which pushes this upper control arm up. So you're actually, when you lower your car like that, you're actually pushing this closer and closer and closer and closer to the strut tower. But what you're not affecting when you do that is the distance between your bump stop and the top of your shock. So your upper control arm hitting your strut tower is a sign that your bump stop is doing nothing, because when your suspension compresses, all of this travels up, and that means that this is hitting your strut tower before your bump stop is stopping your suspension from traveling any further, which is what the bump stop is designed to do. Now, the quick and dirty fix for that, which I've seen people do in the past, which you can do if you really want, is just put washers or spacers or something behind here, behind your bump stop, so that way your suspension has less travel before it hits the bump stop. Because ideally what you want is you want there to be less of a distance between your shock top and your bump stop than what there is between your upper control arm and your strut tower. So that'll fix the bump stop issue quick and dirty, but we're not about quick and dirty, we're about doing this properly here. So how do you do it properly? Well, as I kind of said, what happens is when you wind this down is that it actually pushes this up. So the way to fix your upper control arm from hitting your strut tower is to wind this down, which pulls all of this down. And for any of you who have played around with coilovers in the past, you'll know that if you wind that down, it actually increases your ride height. Now, we'll get around to fixing that soon, but for now, we're just trying to fix the upper control arm and the bump stop issue. That's one problem that we'll fix first, and then we can move on to the ride height problem. So what you need to do is you actually need to, this setup, what I've got here is pretty much what you need to do, except you want to have your bump stop in there. But basically take your coilovers, pull the spring out entirely, and you want to get your jack, and you want to bolt this all together so that the coilover isn't floating around in here loose like mine is. And you want to get your jack, and you want to put your jack underneath your spindle, or under the ball joint down there, and then you want to jack this up and what that'll do is when you jack this spindle up, it'll actually compress the suspension, it'll push all of this up. And what you want to be keeping an eye out for is that you actually want, as this all compresses, you want the top of the shock to hit the bump stop and then compress against the bump stop without your upper control arm hitting your strut tower. If your upper control arm is hitting your strut tower, it means that your overall shock length is too short, so you need to pull the bolt out of the bottom, wind the lower shock mount down a little bit, put it all back together and try it again. And you want to keep going through that process until you can jack this up and then the top of the shock hits the bottom of the bump stop and the whole weight of the car, and the car can be lifted off of the jack stands, and the whole weight of the car is taken on this bump stop without this upper control arm hitting the shock tower. And what you're doing when you're doing that is that, like I said, you're making sure that the bump stop engages before your upper control arm hits the shock tower. So once you've got all of that set up, like we said, lowering this actually increases ride height. Well, how do you combat that? The way that you combat that, again, if you were just going for quick and dirty, get it done sort of solutions, is you get softer springs. Not shorter springs, softer springs. So imagine, let's say for example, imagine these came with most coilovers come with 10 kg springs in the front. Let's say that these are 200 long 10 kg springs. Now, once you've got all of that set up, you put your spring back in. It's 200 long, it's a 10 kg spring. You put the weight of the car down, that spring will compress. So for a 10 kg spring, let's say it compresses 50 mil. So that means you put the spring in, put the car down on the ground, that spring compresses 50 mil, top of the shock moves 50 mil, this all moves 50 mil up, but you're not worried about your bump stop anymore because you fixed that. So that means that your car has, you put your car on the ground, it lowers 50 mil, purely based on the compression of the spring. But since you've jacked your ride height up using this, 50 mil isn't enough anymore. Your car looks like a monster truck. How do you fix that? Point blank, if you were to throw a softer spring in there, that would fix that. The exact same principle. If you were to throw a 200 long, but say half the spring rate, say a 5 kg spring in there, instead of compressing 50 mil, like what the 10 kg spring would, you put a 5 kg spring in there and it compresses, I don't know, let's say 100 mil. So let's say you put it all in, the weight of the car comes down, you've still left all of this, your bump stop's engaging properly, but now, because it's got a way softer spring in there, you put the spring in, the car weight of the car comes down, it compresses that spring 100 mil, which means your car's ride height drops 100 mil. Cool. You're 100 mil lower and your bump stops are all engaging in the correct places, whatever. Problem is, now you've got a 5 kg spring in there, which is super, super, super soft, and we don't want that because we're static boys. So, that's when you go for a heavy spring. This is a 20 kg spring. Now, if you were to throw a 200 mil long 20 kg spring in there, what happens? Well, this spring compresses less from the weight of the car. So you put this spring in, and suddenly your 50 mil of ride height drop that you were getting with your 10 kg spring, maybe you're only getting 25 mil of ride height drop now. So you put the 20 kg spring in and your car barely lowers. So how do you fix that? These are helper springs. So the best way I've seen these described is that these are variable spring rate, and that's probably adjustable spring rate is probably the best way to imagine these. So, as I was saying, imagine that you have a, I don't know, let's say you have a 25 kg, or you have a 20 kg spring in there that only compresses 25 mil. You say you put a 10 kg spring in there, it compresses 50 mil. You put a helper spring on top of that. Now, a helper spring has basically no structural strength whatsoever. This thing will compress with, like, these are like 0.5 kg spring rate. Like, they will just squish the instant there's any weight on them. So what happens is that when you put one of these in, these act as variable spring rate. So that means no matter what, you put these in, they will compress a certain amount. So, for example, this one is 75 mil long free length, and then it has a bind mil of 25 mil, I think, which means that once it's fully completely compressed, it's 25 mil thick, just because of the thickness of the coils. So that means between the 75 mil free length and the 25 mil bind length, it's actually got 50 mils of compression, which means if I was to put this in here, it would compress 50 mil, which means that the car's ride height would drop by 50 mil purely by having this spring in there. So what does that mean? That means we can run a stiff spring with a helper spring. So again, this is a 20 kg spring, and using kind of those same examples as before, imagine your factory 10 kg spring compresses 50 mil. Well, this one only compresses 25 mil, but because I've got the helper spring on the bottom, which compresses 50 mil, that means this 25 kg and helper spring combo will compress a grand total of 75 mil, which is more of a ride height drop than the 10 kg spring, but with the added benefit of having a 20 kg spring taking the weight of the car once the car is settled, which means you'll have a firmer ride as well as being lower than what you were before. So that's how you fix that issue. And your bump stop is all set up properly from you extending the shock. And now you've got a stiff car that drops a lot because you've got a stiff spring with a helper spring on it. So that's what that setup is. That's how you get your car. First, you solve the bump stop issue. Once you've got that solved, you put heavy springs in with helper springs, or you can put soft springs, whatever works for you, whatever you want to do. But I recommend heavy springs with helper springs. And so that will get your car settled low again. So again, that example would be if the 10 kg spring drops 50 mil, this setup would be 20 kgs and also drops 75 mil, which is gets you low as and keeps your car nice and firm. So that's that setup. Now, as we've discussed, now the problem is that and you're like, oh, I can't adjust this, which you don't want to adjust that once you've actually got that set up. Don't touch this. You're like, oh, I can't adjust this to adjust my ride height. How do I adjust my ride height? Well, you adjust the preload on your helper spring. Like I said, these are best described as variable spring rate or adjustable spring rate. So what you can do is, like I said, this is a 75 mil free length and it's got a 25mm bind length, which means as it stands, if you were to put bare minimal preload on this, just enough to keep the spring captive, it would actually have 50mm of travel, which means your car would drop 50mm. If that's too low, what you can actually do is you wind preload onto this, so that way it's already most of the way to its bind length. So say, for example, this is 75mm. If I was to put 25mm of preload on this, so I was to wind this down until it puts a bit of tension on it, so this is compressed 25mm. So now this is only 50mm, but it's got a bind length of 25mm, which means it's only got 25mm of travel before it's completely compressed, which means when the weight of the car is on it, it only compresses 25mm before the mainspring takes over, which compared to the 50mm of before means it only lowers 25mm. So that's how you actually adjust your ride height when you've got a helper spring set up, which means you just adjust the preload to compress this spring or release tension on the spring as much as you want, and that will actually get your ride height. That's how you adjust your ride height when you've got helper springs, which is really cool because that means you can actually, like, you don't have to pull your entire suspension apart. If you have helper springs in your car and you want to adjust your ride height, you just jack it up and then you just wind the collar up and down to adjust your ride height, which is also really cool. I really do like helper springs. But anyway, yeah, that's the basics of it. You want to get your bump stop in there, you want to assemble all this, you want to lengthen this shock until your upper control arm no longer hits your strut tower, and then you want to play around with springs. I highly rate helper springs. They are awesome. Like I said, they allow you to have a stiff spring setup as well and still get a lot of spring compression as well as a lot of spring droop, which again, if you're going for a certification in New Zealand, you need 40mm of droop, which this is plenty. So yeah, hopefully that helps you guys with that. Here is Nismo here to say bye. Yeah, hopefully that helps. It's better than drawings. Don't fuck around with chains, they're expensive.